Okay, right, let's crack on. So once again, thank you to everyone for signing up to our webinar for today, which is how to develop a successful relationship between HR and social media. So just to introduce myself, my name is Kate Allen. I'm the marketing manager here at CrowdControlHQ. My background is in delivering social media campaigns across both the public and private sector, supporting teams with their social media strategy and delivery. But I have the pleasure of being joined today by two experts on HR and social media. We have Darren Bird, former Assistant Director of Professional Standards and Head of Employee Relations at the London Metropolitan Police, and also Alaric Bonthron, former Detective Chief Superintendent and Head of Professional Standards, also from the Met. So welcome, Darren and Alaric, and thanks for joining us.
Morning. Good morning, Kate. Good morning, everyone.
Brilliant. So, Darren and Alaric, for those of us who are not really familiar with the inner workings of the police force, it'd be really great if you could just give us a bit of a brief background into your roles at the Met. Darren, if you want to kick us off.
Certainly, Kate. Good morning, everyone. I spent over 20 years in the Metropolitan Police Service and had an absolutely fantastic time. And I undertook primarily a sort of a wide variety of HR and in old money personnel type roles. I've got a very strong background in diversity and equalities. For a couple of years I managed on behalf of the Met the recruitment, the retention and the progression of underrepresented groups within the MPS. I've got a solid background in training and development, and also recruitment in terms of running large-scale training and recruitment operations. But probably my key skills lie around employee relations. For the last 7 years of my career in the Met, I was responsible for large areas of employee relations. I had the Met's Employment Tribunals unit to look after. I was responsible for the discipline, inefficiency and misconduct management of 20,000 police staff. I also had responsibility for the Met's grievance procedure, and inbuilt with that was around sort of mediation and other early resolution type procedures that many HR professionals on the line will be aware of. And I also got involved during my sort of last 7 years with a lot of trade union and staff association negotiations. So I've got a good and solid background in employee relations.
Fantastic. So just before we go into Alaric, kind of give us a bit of background, Darren, I was wondering if you could just kind of fill us in on kind of professional standards to kind of the layperson, because I know it's very much kind of a police phrase.
Yeah, certainly as far as professional standards are concerned, Alaric and I will know it very much around sort of managing individuals and employees within the organisation and making sure that they don't fall foul of misconduct and inefficiency type procedures, and that's what sort of professional standards meant to us. Alaric, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think Kate and Darren and everyone, good morning. I think there's the added aspect of part of our work was around corruption within professional standards. So it was everything from complaints to corruption. So we had to look at how social media could be used or abused by our staff. So it went across the whole spectrum.
Brilliant. So Alaric, I don't know if you want to give us a quick kind of background into your role at the Met as well.
Yes, certainly, Kate. Good morning all. As I said, I'm a retired Chief Superintendent, having done 30 years in the Met. I joined in 1985, and if we go back then, I think there was only two systems in general use in the Met. One was the national computer that held criminal records and vehicle indexes, and the other, gradually introduced, was the command and control system. I then, through a number of years, ended up in the West End, managing the West End, so Soho and Mayfair, all through the 7/7 bombings and the 21/7 attempts, in terms of sort of keeping public informed and reassurance. I moved into community engagement then, so did a lot of strategic engagement for the Met with underrepresented groups, and trying to seek people, recruitment into the job to improve our numbers. I moved on then to the Olympics, where I was the community engagement and protest lead. So we used a lot of social media, but in terms of that time, it was a lot of analytics behind the social media to understand what was being said about the Met and concerns and issues, and then countered that using social media with the messaging to try and reassure people and keep them informed as to what was going on. Finally, I ended up in professional standards, which was an extremely interesting, challenging role. Dan and I have alluded to what's taken place. And a lot of that was about making sure that the organisation understood what people were attempting to do and how best use could be made of social media and the many, many apps that have sort of grown up around that period of time. To the extent we were involved a lot with our Department of Information and Technology around app development and trying to build in safeguards before we even launched them internally.
Sounds fantastic. Perfect, and that leads us straight into our agenda for today. So for everyone who's on the line, over the next kind of 30 to 40 minutes, we're going to kind of set the scene in terms of, both Darren and Alaric have talked a little bit about IT systems, but obviously kind of the development of those and them being introduced into the Met. Then we're obviously going to move more and have more focus on the evolution of social media, and then obviously a look at the challenges that it brought to an institution like the Metropolitan Police. And then obviously the real kind of golden nuggets of information are going to be, the steps to prevent kind of social media faux pas from an individual, but also from an organisational perspective happening. And then finally, we're going to have some time for questions. And if anyone on the line does have any questions at any point throughout the webinar, please don't hesitate to kind of jot them down. You'll notice on the right-hand side of your screen, hopefully you'll have a little toolbar which will have the option for you to kind of submit any questions that you have, and we'll keep a note of them and then kind of follow up with them as and when appropriate. So fantastic. So the first kind of section, obviously, we are talking about setting the scene and with IT. So Alaric, as kind of a senior manager within the Met, you obviously the internet was kind of booming. You talked about how, originally when you started there were only 2 major computer systems. But it'd be good to know, obviously, with the internet kind of emerging in the 90s, and technology rapidly evolving, and this obviously saw a bit of a change in the way that the police needed to behave. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Certainly, Kate. I mean, if you look at the overall crime perspective, society is changing and changing at a rapid rate at the moment. So my children in their late teens, early 20s are seeing things evolve very, very quickly. Whereas when I was younger, and Darren was definitely younger, things took a lot longer to develop. It was 10, 12, 15 years. So when you go back to the 50s, 60s and 70s, and you look at bank security, we had things like cash in transit robberies. So the vans that moved the cash, the men were robbed on the street pavements. People got together in pubs. We'll all have seen it in the films, where people get together in the pubs. And I suppose a bit of a hark back to that is the recent Hatton Garden bullion robbery, where they met in pubs, when the story came out, and they worked out what they were going to do. They were very old-fashioned, whereas now, if you look at cybercrime, and we'll all have seen the news headlines, people are constantly being attacked and evolve the threat through massive global issues. It's not just London-based crime, UK-based crime. You've got people targeting people from all over the world, and it's more and more difficult to try and control cybercrime, the use of cyber communication. You've got, all the issues that came out from the Snowden stuff about encryption and other things. So police forces and the public have got a massive challenge around trying to keep ahead of the criminals. And lots of that work is around prevention, as well as trying to build systems to make them more secure.
So in terms of, obviously, so you've kind of set the scene around the kind of change and evolution of IT and obviously cybercrime coming onto the scene. Social media, has been started to kind of really emerge on the scene about a decade ago, and it introduced a completely new nature of communication in the fact that obviously it's a much more two-way channel where you know, customers can talk directly to organisations, but then also organisations can talk directly to customers. And so it's a much more kind of uncontrolled channel of communication, which has been fairly, I guess, alien to such a traditional institution such as the Met. So Alec, I was just wondering, in fact, Darren, I was wondering if you could tell me about kind of the challenges that this kind of brought.
Absolutely, Kate. I think it's fair to say, and it may resonate with other people, the Met is a very large organisation, and at times it can be quite bureaucratic, and it's also very hierarchical. So the profile of it didn't really lend itself from the outset to embracing social media and necessarily recognising the benefits straight away, as well as the challenges that social media brought. And many sort of senior officers sort of buried their head in the sand and thought, well, it's a passing fad that would go away. The reality was it didn't go away, and it's certainly here to stay. And once the Met realised that, it started very quickly getting upstream around social media. But in terms of the benefits, as a policing organisation, we quickly realised it was an opportunity for much faster communication. It was an opportunity to get a lot of instant feedback from our customers and from the public of London. Not all of it good, but all of it giving us an opportunity to sort of learn and develop for the future. At a more tactical level, social media immediately began to sort of help us with crime appeals and engaging with, in particular, hard to reach communities where traditionally sometimes being able to speak to them and understanding their needs was often difficult to do. So once we got over the reality that social media was here to stay and we needed to embrace it, the Met very quickly realised that it was a powerful tool in which to use effectively.
So Darren, you've touched on the Met obviously being quite a complex organisation in terms of rolling out social media. I was just wondering if you could tell us why it was such a challenge.
Yeah, I think there are three reasons, Kate. And without over-egging the pudding, because I think all of us work in complex organisations one way or the other. But if we think about the Met, and from mine and Alaric's experience, and putting it into context, there were sort of over 100 different policing type departments, everything from counter-terrorism through to rape investigations, and then more obscure departments such as wildlife crime departments or art and antiquity type departments, and not to mention the sort of volume crime departments, the police on the street who across the 32 boroughs of London are protecting people day in and day out. So immediately from a social media perspective, in terms of the complexity of the organisation, there wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach to social media. The Met realised that it could use social media in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different sort of areas, but it had to be smarter way around the way that it actually did that. Alaric's spoken around sort of security issues and the importance. The lifeblood of any policing organisation is around the information and the intelligence that it holds, and without that, and without being secure, there's obviously problems. But social media also brought individual type security issues. And we had a couple of examples, and Alaric may elaborate a little bit more, where baddies or criminal networks were actually using social media to target particular police officers. And it's really interesting how quickly and how fast, using open source type information through social media, that policing operations or individuals can be targeted and policing operations disrupted because of security breaches around social media. And the final piece really is just around brand reputation. The Metropolitan Police is a brand, and we really value our brand, and I think people across the UK and globally will know the Scotland Yard brand. 3 or 4 years ago, the Met took a real beating around the sort of Leveson inquiry, if people remember that, around our policing interaction with journalists, and that damaged our brand. And UK and abroad, making sure that we protect our brand is absolutely paramount. And because if we don't protect our brand, we immediately lose the trust and confidence of the people that we're there to protect. So social media, again, just added a different dimension because of the nature of the communication in terms of how we move forward and ways in which we look to sort of better manage our brand. And Alaric, I don't know whether you've got any additional comments on that.
No, I think it is the challenge, isn't it? We've moved, everyone has a mobile phone, everyone's got access to that, so it's not even that you've got, you know, controlled systems within your organization. So whilst you might think your intelligence or your information is secure, someone can take a screenshot and then send that on, whereas in the past they weren't able to do that. And it's the ability of large organizations to keep dexterous, really, to the changes that are taking place.
Fantastic. So that's a kind of brilliant setting the scene of, you know, the introduction of social media and how the Met kind of identified the opportunities, but also the risks that it posed, as well as kind of the three kind of facets that, you know, were kind of key criteria and key kind of elements to the Met embracing social media. So moving on to kind of the first major challenge, the public nature of social media is well known for many organisations. Alaric, I was just wondering if you could tell us how it affected the Met in particular.
Yeah, I think, you know, the headline slide there is everyone's a journalist, and that's very true now. You know, people can comment live at crime scenes. You know, you'll have seen it from the tragic death of the MP, that people were sort of tweeting pictures as the police and other services were trying to deal with those issues. So it really brings a level of scrutiny over public services and public bodies trying to do their work in a completely different way. And Darren's mentioned security. There's information security. You know, your company, your housing association or whatever, health service, all have information that other people would like to get hold of. And it's trying to educate staff around the dangers of, especially in the police service, where we're a 24/7 organisation and officers and staff are meant to behave along the code of ethics 24/7, 365. There's no off time where you can be someone different and comment. And a prime example of that was, I don't know if any of you remember it, during Margaret Thatcher's funeral, there was an individual tweeted, said he was a police officer, tweeted that he was glad she was dead, used rather offensive language. And what happened very quickly as a result of that tweet, that officer was identified by the media. They turned up at his doorstep, they started asking questions, they trolled all of his social media, tweets, Facebook and everything else, and built a profile about him. And actually that led to them, I suppose in the old days, they would have had to wait till the next day to publish that in the headlines, but it was live on the internet as they were doing their inquiries. So it just highlights the sensitivity and the need to get understanding into staff around the benefits of social media for the organisation, but also the risks. So if you're looking at individuals in sensitive roles, you know, it's about educating them around what they do, what they say. Other examples of where, with the best intentions, things have gone wrong. Many of you saw that the police helicopter, which is now the National Police Air Service, tweeted pictures of Michael McIntyre on a night out. What they were trying to do was build up some sort of fun images and to raise numbers on their Twitter profiles. But that led to a massive backlash around invasion of privacy, breaching that individual's human rights. We've also had the helicopter. We used to get lots of complaints about noise, especially in the Mayfair area, West End, with all the demonstrations and the helicopter being up. So the helicopter team started, I suppose the easiest way to put it is arguing with the public. So they'd be out at night trying to find an armed gunman in back gardens, and someone would tweet, you know, turn the helicopter off, leave me alone. And instead of trying to explain, they started arguing back, well, we're trying to keep you safe. Again, it was with the best intention, but Twitter's only got a certain amount, or did have a certain amount of space to be able to do that. So again, it's about understanding the impact these things have. And once they're out there, it's very difficult to get them back and to retract them. You can cancel a tweet, but it could have been screenshot. And then operationally for us, the other issue was some of our officers would tweet when they were on what we called aids, so operations. And they potentially there could identify police tactics where police were grouping. And there's all the other issues about trying to get people to turn off apps on their phone which identify where they are. If people are following them, they can identify where they are and what they're doing. So those are just some of the real challenges around an organisation like the Met or a health service or a council or something, trying to keep control but allow the staff to use the technology for the benefit of the organisation.
I think that's a brilliant point that you made in your answer there about, once a tweet is out there, although it can be deleted, it's not really ever fully deleted because people can obviously still screenshot it. Journalists are trawling around social media to pick up stories, and obviously kind of the nature of a lot of the stories that you'll notice in newspapers now will typically be sourced from social media. So I think that's a kind of a really important thing to mention, particularly to staff, obviously when you're training, is to be very, very careful before you post. So moving on to kind of it kind of seamlessly links us into our next kind of challenge. So talking about instant communication. So we've discussed obviously that social media is the first of its kind, and the fact that traditionally we had radio adverts, kind of one-way communication, and social media was the first where it really gave our customers a platform to kind of be in a public discussion. It also obviously kind of gave them opportunity to instantly comment. So obviously Alaric's kind of discussion around kind of noisy helicopters and people complaining, it provides the perfect platform for that. So Darren, in terms of this instantaneous nature of social media, what kind of issues did this create in terms of managing brand reputation for the Met?
Okay, yeah, obviously Alaric's sort of spoken about some of the sort of fast time examples. I think we were confronted with some other challenges around sort of social media in particular. As you can imagine with the police service, usually at the end of officers and police staff careers, many of the senior ones or those who worked in specialist roles wanted to write books about their time in the police service. And years ago we used to have the opportunity when they were doing that to work with publishers to make sure that anything that they were writing about wouldn't at a later date bring the service into disrepute, whether by giving away tradecraft secrets, involving us in litigation, or just simply embarrassing us as an organisation. But with the explosion of social media, again we were confronted with a scenario where individuals could blog posts, put out information with a high degree of anonymity without the organisation being able to effectively respond in a sort of timely manner. So immediately again there was another social media challenge with us in relation to that. Also another sort of key issue that Met faced early on was around, I use the term officers or members of staff with good intentions responding to tweets or responding to inbound communication from the public via social media, but not actually sort of thinking about the bigger picture. And there were a couple of examples, and like many public service organisations over the last 5 years, they've been going through massive sort of challenges and fiscal challenges, and where members of the public were, for want of a better word, moaning around sort of policing response in their particular area. Managers of teams and of stations were quick to try and sort of alleviate the fears and offer I suppose outcomes that weren't realistic with the budget challenges that were faced, and with good intentions tweeting out how they're going to improve matters, but the reality was corporately with the budget challenges faced that we couldn't actually meet their expectations, and so you had corporate messages saying one thing and local messages saying something else, and there was a disconnect, and there was a lack of sometimes governance around what people on the ground were saying and what actually the corporate objectives and the corporate strategy wanted us to say.
That's brilliant. And Darren, we've had a question in from someone on the line who's actually asked about how social media has created an increase in the number of people commenting on issues, possibly from their personal accounts, but don't necessarily toe the kind of organisational line. So I think you've answered that brilliantly in terms of, it has caused a huge increase in the number of people who, have kind of slipped up and responded to kind of, inbound inquiries or anything, with kind of good intentions, but unfortunately not necessarily matching corporate expectations. We're going to go into it later on in the webinar in terms of, how to avoid that from happening and steps that you can take to prevent it. So in terms of the next challenge, Darren, as the slide says, how can you police the police?
From what Alaric and I have been speaking about, it was really difficult for us. I think that's the reality. I don't know whether, Kate, you could take us to the next slide, but from a HR employee relations perspective, Alaric and I were always constantly dealing, like many of you are in public service organisations, dealing with freedom of information requests. We did it across a whole sort of spectrum of issues, but there was often a lot of freedom of information requests coming in from journalists or other people in the media about social media in particular. And just to put a stat up on the board, between 2009 and 2014, there were almost 830 cases of social media, best described faux pas. Again, putting that into perspective, at least 10% or nearly 10% of those 830 people either resigned or were dismissed because of their behaviours either on duty or off duty around social media. So, Alaric, I don't know, again, whether you've got any further comments, but it was a massive challenge for us, and at times it felt like we were pushing a bit of the boulder up a hill.
Yeah, and I think, with the code of ethics being launched and the expectations around officers, what we're getting is officers and staff reporting other people within the organisation that they know who've slipped up, abused, or been mischievous or downright nasty on the on the social media websites, which has increased the number of investigations. And some of the challenges around that for law enforcement is how you access half these systems. If you look at Snapchat now, it's all encrypted. Lots of them are offshore in the States or things, so trying to get information post-Snowden is almost impossible. So it's that fine balance about trying to investigate things where they've gone wrong, but not being able to get enough evidence is, one of the main challenges now.
I think it's fair to say, though, in all of those examples, and people hopefully online still will, draw parallel to their own organisation. Every time there is, a social media breach of that nature, it does cause reputational damage, or it could cause reputational damage. On occasions, it did cause us litigation, and on other occasions, it caused operational and individual security issues. So, not good.
Okay, so we've kind of covered the kind of key challenges that the Met faced with the introduction of social media. But obviously, the steps of prevention, how can we prevent this in the future? Darren, I was wondering if you could kick us off.
Yeah, certainly. And trying to I know that we've been very focused around policing and giving policing examples, but drawing it back now, very much around HR. We've sort of got 5-step process really. Number one, without stating the blindingly obvious, it's about recruitment, and it's about your recruitment policies and procedures that you have in place. Number one around recruitment, making sure, and again doing it legitimately, but that you're doing, if you're an organisation that value your brand, need to protect your reputation, making sure that individuals that you are recruiting, that you're doing appropriate open source searches, if necessary, around their social media profiles. That's always a sensible thing to do. In addition to that, built into contracts of employment, if necessary, certainly policies and procedures, which we'll talk about in a minute, but within contracts of employment, giving cognizance to people's behaviour on and off duty, but also building in stuff around their general use of media and social media, both inside and outside of the organisation, just reinforcing messages and doing that at the earliest stage. If people aren't members of your organisation, making sure as well within the literature that you send out that they very quickly become aware that if they're joining your organisation, these are your expectations. Second point is around once people have joined, we all like to sort of give really good induction processes, and induction processes around the role that they're doing and about the culture of the organisation. What Alaric and I built into the Met's induction processes was making sure that there were appropriate professional standards induction processes, but the key facets within that was about appropriate use of IT systems and also appropriate use of social media both on and off duty, and to make sure that from day one of joining the organisation that individuals knew our expectations, and that if they transgressed, what the potential and likely implications were, and to making sure that individuals knew that ultimately if they breached guidelines, it could result in their dismissal from the organisation, and going in hard but fairly from the outset. And the final piece from me before I pass over to Alaric was around building effective policies and operating procedures. And for an organisation the size of the Met, and for sort of many of you in larger organisations, it's about having policies that are not sort of gathering dust on shelves and that are not outdated as soon as you write them, but building a framework within which sort of standard operating procedures or policies could sit that again outline how the Met wanted individuals to use IT, and also therein how they expected them to use social media both on and off duty. So a key one for us, and some of the key pieces of work that Alaric and I did before we left the organisation, was making sure that there were some sort of policies and governance procedures that sort of gave people a framework upon which to work within. Alaric, I don't know if you want to sort of pick up the final two.
Yeah, I'll pick those up. Just a couple of points from what you've said there, just for people's information. What we used to do at the recruitment induction phase is at Hendon, as was, they used to get groups of 100 and 150 trainee officers, and during the first few weeks, the professional standards team that we had went up there. And what they'd done is they'd open sourced a couple of people from that group. So they'd gone through their profiles, and they used to go in literally and just say, whose great aunt is Matilda Jones? And you used to see them all looking at each other. Who's got 500 or up to 1,000 friends on Facebook? And the shock on some of the recruits' faces that that level of information was available for someone with very little IT skills was one of the main sort of shock factors we gave them before we dropped into that social media awareness modules. And I think recently, I don't know if you'll have seen, there's a new app launched for landlords which scoops social media and can give landlords a profile of a potential tenant. So again, it's trying to keep professional standards up to speed on what's coming, so they can then use that to brief and keep the new recruits and our serving officers up to date. And I think, as Darren said, one of the main things is creating an environment and a culture that's corrective and not punitive. And part of our role within professional standards was to try and rein in the organisation to hang people for silly mistakes. And you'll have seen on that slide where people were given things called written warnings, so the lower end of the admonishment scale. But we also did a lot of work around the Code of Ethics, which was launched just before we finished the year before. to make people understand the nature of the organisation, the expectations of the public in terms of policing, both police staff and police officers. And then in the training, it was to make sure they understood some of the faux pas that have been made, such as the helicopter issues that I told you about. And also that before they did anything, to get it cross-checked by someone else, you know, a third eye look at it to make sure, hang on a minute, that doesn't make sense, or, oh, wait a minute. And there was always advice available from our media teams. And then publicising the dangers and pitfalls of social media. What we regularly did was met with the staff unions, with the police federation, and gave them briefings about things people were doing. So when their representatives met members of staff, they were an opportunity to have discussions with them as well. And that also was done to managers. So we regularly, the senior managers in the Met got together. Professional standards kept senior managers adrift. So we were trying to educate all aspects of the organisation so that when they were having meetings with staff, they could talk about the latest issues and to keep staff up to date and the threats and risks around at this moment in time.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Darren and Alaric, for kind of giving us a quick kind of introduction into the kind of key steps for prevention in terms of, you know, trying to develop a successful relationship between HR and social media. I don't know if anyone, we've had a couple of questions come in already, but I don't know if anyone wants to jot any down on the chat section on the right-hand side. But just as a summary, Darren and Alaric have both covered, you know, some really key points around some of the challenges and how it was managed by the Met. One of the kind of key takeaways that I brought away from it is that having an oversight of social media, all of the channels, whether that's kind of in just your channels that you're posting out, but also being aware of what others are saying about you and obviously engaging with your organisation. So this leads on to being open to listening. So obviously if you're going to have social media channels, it's important to be on it, but do it in an environment that is encouraging but supportive for your staff. Also, Alaric's point, I can't kind of let that drop about 24/7. You know, police officers, they take a code of ethics of being a 24/7 job, 365 days a year. Social media doesn't turn off outside of working hours. It's an instantaneous channel that needs to be monitored and resourced accordingly, and you have to manage your customers' expectations. In terms of the process of managing multiple members of staff, obviously Darren and Alaric talked about, you know, at any one point they were having to kind of be responsible for more than 20,000 police staff. But, you know, it's critical for them to manage the process from the very start in terms of, you know, starting at recruitment, having a solid but flexible social media policy that wasn't going to go out of date kind of the day after it was written, as we know that social media is such an evolving channel. But also making sure that there's kind of continual updates and communication between internal departments to keep them abreast of any changes. So, you know, Alaric mentioned about there being a new app that landlords can get social media profile information. So obviously kind of the communication between departments of how the other departments can manage their staff is critical as well. So one of the questions that we've had in, Darren and Alaric, is so traditionally social media tends to sit within the marketing department. How did HR get brought in to, you know, have such involvement on social media within the Met?
Do you want to pick that, Alaric?
Yeah, okay. I think the main thing for us was if it was abused in any way, shape or form, then, you know, personally in officers or staff's personal accounts, it came in with our arena. So we got involved early on, as I said, for our Department of Information. We were using they, independently of the rest of the organisation, were testing a new system on the Microsoft platform, which allowed, it was a bit like a chat room, I can't remember the name of it, but what we subsequently found out only through a poster was that members of the sort of central communications branch were slagging off their managers and using these forums to do that, but we didn't know about the platform and couldn't access it. So It was to try and limit our workload, and also to try and make sure, as we say, that we're, 300 staff looking after an organisation of 55,000 isn't very many. And the workload we had already from complaints and other things meant we wanted to get ahead of the game and try and shut these stupid behaviours down before they drew us into that sort of employee relations type world.
I think I'd just very briefly add is that social media isn't the sole responsibility of HR, and that's not what we're saying here today. But we do really strongly consider that all aspects of HR and within all elements of HR, there is a responsibility around social media. And so I think it's really important for HR professionals to be aware of that and making sure that, when they're delivering their sort of HR strategies and their plans, that social media is recognised and is not an afterthought. Because I think, like we did on occasions, sort of we repented at leisure where we hadn't been upstream of issues. And so you've got a responsibility, but it's not your sole responsibility, but play your part.
I couldn't agree more, Darren. Here at CrowdControlHQ, often with the organisations that we work for, successful social media is an enterprise element. It needs to be rolled out across multiple teams and is responsible for multiple areas of the business, from customer services to marketing, obviously HR involvement in terms of kind of managing the process. It's critical for kind of lots of different individuals to be involved, and I think it's no longer something that people can ignore and keep kind of shut away to kind of the graduate of the organisation who sat in the marketing department. So on that note, another question we've had in is, which I think we've touched upon a little bit, but should our HR teams check out candidates on social media as part of the recruitment process?
I think that's a decision for the individual organisation, to be honest. Obviously, policing, we have to do background checks. I mean, going back to 1985 when I joined, I lived in Scotland at the time, and we had a sergeant from the local force come to my house and interview me, look round the house, speak to my parents separately from me, and make a decision whether I was a suitable individual. What we now do is we do it with the online profile to make sure, the last thing you want to do is recruit someone with, say, for example, neo-Nazi issues on their Facebook page or things like that, because that would bring the organisation into disrepute straight away if someone else found that. So I think it's a matter for individual organisations and potentially the roles, because in the police service, some of us were vetted, and there'll be other organisations where people are vetted to get access to more secretive information, and you automatically expose people to that process. So it's an individual company's decision about what they want. I do know outside of public services there are some organisations ask people to show them their profiles. Whether that's right or wrong is a matter for the HR department.
And I think what I would add there, as a HR practitioner, I would use all the tools at your disposal to make sure that you get the best candidates, and social media is a tool for that, both proactively in terms of attracting candidates, but reactively having a look at the prospective candidates that you've got. Our only point would be make sure you do it legitimately and legally. I'm sure you do, but personally use the tools at your disposal.
Brilliant. So I think obviously in terms of the legal implications, obviously Alaric, you talked about how obviously when you were interviewed back in '85 that, because of the role that you were doing, you knew that there was a certain level of vetting that needed to be required. As long as organisations are upfront and open about they are going to be kind of doing an open check. I think obviously that's, as Darren said, it's the tools that are available to you. Social media is a public channel, and so there are kind of levels of privacy that need to be set. And again, as part of the HR process internally, making your employees aware of the levels of privacy and the changes. As we know, social media platforms, their privacy kind of settings tend to change quite frequently, but keeping your colleagues aware of the levels of privacy that they might want to have on their account. If it's posting a photo, do you want it visible for only friends or friends of friends, or is it a public photo? So again, you know, the communication and education process for employees is critical. So that pretty much takes us up to the end of our webinar for today. But I'd just like to thank Darren and Alaric for obviously joining us and providing such kind of brilliant information and insight into how social media was introduced and managed within the Met. So thanks very much, Darren and Alaric.
Thank you, everybody, for coming online.
No problem. And then in terms of, obviously, if you'd like to find out any more information about managing HR and social media, or would like to find out more about how our social media risk management and compliance platform, CrowdControlHQ, can help you, please don't hesitate to get in contact with us via info@CrowdControlHQ, and you can speak to one of our social media specialists. Alternatively, if you'd like to continue the conversation with us over on Twitter, we are @CrowdControlHQ, or perhaps over on our Facebook page, and again, it's just CrowdControlHQ. So thanks again to everyone for listening, and we hope you have a very good rest of the day.